The girl stared at herself in the mirror. The slight bulge in her belly really made her worry. The test paper slowly showed 2 bars. She was pregnant. The girl's name was Annie. From her birth until now, she had grown up with her father's cynicism. Annie had grown accustomed to her father's disdain. However, her resistance was limited to a single word after an argument. This family environment led her to develop a silent and closed personality. She became more withdrawn when she learned of her pregnancy. She would lie in bed every night, deep in thought. Often she would not sleep at all. When her mother saw her tired face the next day, she asked her if she needed to see a doctor. Annie refused her mother's offer, but as soon as she left the house, she turned around and entered a clinic down the road. She wanted to check the authenticity of her pregnancy again. As you can imagine, the test paper was still positive. Annie couldn't accept the fact that she was pregnant. Undeterred, she asked,
"If it's positive, is there any way it could be negative?" "No. A positive is always a positive."
Hearing this answer from the doctor, her last illusion was shattered. Back home, Annie made a cruel decision. She felt that her body should be in her control. To demonstrate her sovereign control over her body, she used a paper clip to painfully attach a nose stud to herself. The next day, Annie came back to the clinic for a detailed examination. The doctor applied couplant to her stomach and said to her,
"It's the most magical sound you will ever hear."
But it wasn't. When Annie heard the baby's heartbeat, she closed her eyes in pain. The sound broke her. Then she turned her head away and looked like she couldn't see it. The doctor told her she was 10 weeks pregnant. The fetus was almost ready to be born. The doctor could see it in Annie's eyes. She started to talk Annie into trying to get her to give up the idea of abortion. She even showed an educational video against abortion. But Annie was determined and didn't let her brainwash her. But here's the thing. Annie found out online that abortion is not allowed in her city. Desperate, she had no choice but to try to abort herself. Annie kept swallowing pill after pill. Then she started pounding her belly. But it was all for naught. And so the days went by. One day Annie was at work when she suddenly had a fit of vomiting. She rushed into the bathroom to hide, but her cousin followed her. The 2 sisters, who had played together since they were children, were naturally in sympathy. Jenny immediately sensed that Annie was pregnant. At night, they walked out of the office. Jenny stuffed all her money into Annie's bag. Annie, who was not good with words, finally had a light in her eyes. The 2 then packed their bags and booked their tickets. While it was still light, they walked with their big suitcases under the yellowing streetlights and embarked on their abortion journey. Because the city of New York supports abortion for women, so the 2 sisters boarded a bus to New York City. Looking out the window at the receding landscape, Annie was lost in thought. At that moment, a man approached Jenny. He wanted to invite them to a movie. Jenny politely turned him down but finally exchanged cell phone numbers with the man. The bus finally arrived in New York in the evening. The 2 sisters, who were in New York for the first time, couldn't enjoy the scenery and rushed to the hospital. The doctors here examined Annie again. Anne's stomach was covered with bruises from her own beatings when she lifted her shirt. Worse still, this time the results showed that Annie was 18 weeks pregnant. It was clear that the previous doctor had lied. The purpose was to delay Annie's miscarriage. The doctor also said that the hospital has a rule that they can only operate on pregnant women within 12 weeks. But she didn't have to worry. They could transfer Annie to a nearby hospital. Annie had no choice but to compromise. The planned trip would take another day. The 2 sisters had no money left to stay in a hotel. They had to snuggle up in the station and rest. But it wasn't long before the station manager told them to leave. The 2 sisters had no choice but to find a place to spend the night again. After tossing and turning the whole way, finally they came to the arcade to pass the time. So the 2 sisters finally survived their first night. The next day, Annie and Jenny headed to the hospital at dawn. They ate breakfast on the subway. A bright smile appeared on their faces, but the relaxing time didn't last long. On the way, they ran into an anti-abortion march. Annie's mood plummeted to the bottom. Couldn't she even have the right to control her own body? Entering the hospital, the staff made it clear to Annie if she used health insurance, all the bills would be sent to her parents. Annie hesitated for a moment and finally took out all the money she had to pay for the operation. After paying the money, the hospital social worker asked a series of questions. In the face of this survey, Annie only had to answer 4 words: never, rarely, sometimes, always. A seemingly multiple-choice survey made Annie, who was calm, become nervous.
Your partner has threatened or frightened you.
Annie pretended to be calm and did not want to answer. When the social worker asked a second time, she held back her emotions and answered,
Rarely.
Then the social worker sensed Annie's change in mood. She gently asked the next question. The
Your partner has hit you, slapped you, or physically hurt you.
social worker softly reassured Annie and then asked Annie the last question.
Your partner has made you have sex when you didn't want to.
At this point, Annie's fragile nerves felt like they were being stabbed hard. Some unpleasant memories from the past pierced her strong surface like a sharp knife. Annie shed tears and finally admitted to the fact that she had been sexually abused. Annie changed into her surgical gown. The first part of the surgery was to be completed today. Anxiously, she lay on the operating table. The social worker stayed by her side and held her hand tightly. After the surgery, Annie and Jenny were walking aimlessly on the street. At that moment, Jenny realized that there was no money left in her wallet, and explained that she had spent all her money on the operation to keep the abortion a secret. Annie felt very sorry for herself. She didn't want to bother Jenny anymore and said to her,
You can go home if you want.
Jenny didn't answer. She understood Annie's pain and pressure, but now they don't even have the money to go home. At this point, Jenny wanted to seek help from her parents. However, Annie had always been at odds with her parents, so she said to her, Jenny was very angry and left with her suitcase. Annie, who was worried, found her in the bathroom. Jenny didn't say anything and took out concealer for Annie to cover up the dark circles under her eyes. How can the two of them, who have a strong sisterly bond, just break up? Finally, Jenny was desperate and contacted the man who had approached them. The man arrived as promised. He offered to go to the bar for a drink. Jenny excuses herself and says she'd like to have dinner first. At the table, the man asked about the two sisters and suggested the idea of going to a bar again. Jenny says no, we
really can't.
After dinner, the three go to the bowling alley, but Annie was never happy. The first stage of the surgery had left her feeling very uncomfortable. Annie rushed to the bathroom. Then she called her mother. Annie did not answer and finally hung up the phone. Later the three went to a karaoke bar. The man put his hand on Jenny's thigh while Annie was singing. Jenny just smiled and acquiesced to the man's behavior. After the event, Jenny finally asked the man to borrow money. The man readily agreed, but he asked Jenny to go with him to get the money. Annie understood that she could not do anything, only agreed to wait in the same place. However, after a long time, the two men did not return. Annie was very anxious. She looked everywhere for Jenny. Finally, she spotted the two making out behind a pillar. Annie slowly approached. She quietly took Jenny's hand. The two hands were held tightly together. All she could do was to be there. Finally, the man kept his promise and lent them the money. The next day, Annie and Jenny came back to the hospital. Today was the final stage of the operation. Jenny saw Annie's nervousness and showed her a little magic trick. Annie's nerves relaxed a little. It wasn't long before Annie was on the operating table again. The doctor asked her,
What procedure are you having?
I'm having an abortion.
Annie's eyes slowly closed as the anesthetic took effect. When she opened her eyes again, the operation was completed. The two sisters walked down the road with their heavy suitcases. Before going home, they entered a restaurant to rest. Jenny kept stuffing her mouth with bread. After looking at each other, they finally smiled with relief. This is the end of the film. Luckily, the story has a hopeful and bright ending. In the future, T2 may tell someone the secret of her pregnancy, or she may hide it for the rest of her life. Either way, we won't know. After all, this is her body and her story. May the world never be Annie's again. Follow me. Next issue is more exciting.